you first arrived in Russia late 2001, 2002. Tell us about the Russia that you saw on arrival.
It was, a bewildering place to land. I remember the first night I was staying in, there was a Sheraton hotel. We were staying, my wife and I, also a Carleton journalism graduate. And we were staying on a hotel in Tverskaya Avenue in the center of the city. And I remember just walking down this sort of blizzarded streets. And it was, all that I knew about Russia going into that moment was, I'd seen Rocky III and Rocky IV, sorry, and Red Dawn and all that, and had these stereotypes in my mind. And my father had always been someone who was fascinated by Russian history growing up, so I had sort of a knowledge of the background. But the thing that stuck out of my mind, and they don't think they exist, or haven't seen them as often anymore, were these black cars with a blue light on top, and they were supposed to be senior civil servants could this show that you were important and everybody should get out of your way, and the traffic laws didn't really matter to these cars. But inevitably, these got sold onwards, and so businessmen would buy them, and sometimes mafia would buy them. And they were just these cars, you didn't know who it was, but they were just above the law and screaming through the center of the city. And one famous incident, two of these cars met each other head on because they both thought the other person was going to move first. But that was a very different time from now, and there was a hint of the lawlessness, I think, of the 1990s, of the Yeltsin era, and it was instructive to arrive at the start of that transition to where the country has gone since.
Why did Russians choose Putin, or did they choose Putin?
I think it's one of the things that the book that I wrote 10 years ago with the title "The New Cold War," which at the time felt really hyperbolic, but now seems a little more measured, was I focused on a few characters who had played a role in shaping the Russian system, which they call managed democracy. At which the thinking behind it is Russia is on a track towards democracy, but it needs to be controlled because it's transitioning from this authoritarian past. And I asked one of them this question. I said, so why Putin? How did you get Putin? And he said, literally, it could have been any one of, Boris Yeltsin went through 5 changes of prime minister, I think, in the last 2 years that he was in office. And these guys were charged with what they called Project Successor, figuring out what to do and how to shape the person that came next. And it was Sergei Stepashin, who is a very different character from Putin, was the prime minister, and then suddenly they had this guy, Putin, was decided he'd be the successor because of his perceived loyalty. And these spin doctors were charged with sort of making him into the man for all seasons and to making him the answer to every question. He was he was young and healthy, unlike Yeltsin, who was sort of old and drunk, frankly. And he was a man of action. They just famously filmed him sort of flying into the airport on a fighter jet in Grozny during the war in Chechnya. And so my closest Russian friends, they all did vote for Putin in 2000 because to them he looked like change. He looked like stability, strength, while also he was perceived as a person who was perhaps, he had a KGB background, yes, but he also was part of the reformist camp in the minds of some because he'd been a deputy to the governor of St. Petersburg, who was seen as a more Western-leaning politician. And they voted for him in 2000, and then 4 years later, they voted against him, and since then they've stopped voting. But initially, who definitely was, and these are Muscovites, I should say. If you go outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, the support for Mr. Putin is quite deep and genuine.
What were the most important stories then? And looking back, this is a double-barreled question, which we're not supposed to do.
It's in the Canadian Reporter, they say not to. Looking
back now, what do you realize now was the most important story that you missed?
That's a good question.
In those early days.
When I first arrived, there were two sort of stories that were both sort of the big story was the war in Chechnya and Putin's efforts to bring that under control and to sort of end the series of attacks that Russia had experienced. And then there was the secondary, and this one was a much tougher sell to my editors, and it was the closing of independent media spaces. And so organizations that were, and Mr. Putin's eyes, are owned by oligarchs who had made a lot of money illicitly in the 1990s, and now were using this to sort of cause trouble, to undermine his goal of bringing stability to the state. But at the end of the day, it shrank the number of voices that were speaking in Russian, to the point now today where there are some independent media in Moscow again, but not very much. And that one I wish we'd paid more attention to. But it was really hard to explain to my editors in 2002 or 2003 that they had to carry this story about the crackdown on TV6 because they'd never heard of TV6 before, and it didn't seem to matter. And it was there was. More broadly, I arrived in Moscow right on the heels of September the 11th, and all of a sudden, the story was Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East, and eventually I was transferred there for that reason. And it was very hard to convince them that we had to pay attention to what seemed like incremental changes in a country which now, 10, 15 years later, we see that's changed quite dramatically.
You covered Beslan, the massacre in 2004, and I've heard you describe that as one of the things that has left the greatest impression on you. Can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, one of those questions that I got asked is something, what was your favorite story to cover? What was the most difficult story to cover? And I used to always say that the Orange Revolution in Ukraine was my favorite story because it was, it's just weeks and weeks of sort of peaceful protest and hope, and people discovering that their opinions were shared by a larger number of people. It was just a lot of fun to be there. And then Beslan, which happened within months, or I think 2 months before the Orange Revolution sort of began, is the one that, it's impossible to shake out of your mind. I got there.
Remind us what happened.
Yeah. For anyone who doesn't know the story, a gang of Chechen fighters who were loyal to sort of a separatist/jihadist leader in Chechnya took over a middle school. It was middle school number 1, if my memory doesn't fail me here. And on the first day of schools, and then they kept for 3 days. They had hundreds of parents and kids trapped inside there with no water, no food, and then. An order was given. It's very complicated, very confusing what happened. A bang went off, and the army stormed in, and there was a lot of, I think, there was, the number was hundreds, I think, that got killed in the firefight that ensued. And a lot of them were kids. And I just remember the next day coming up, there wasn't a proper police line around the school, and so myself and a lot of other journalists just sort of walked up looking for someone to interview about what had happened, and we ended up inside this charred, burned out school, which was obviously a crime scene, and there were still, frankly, pieces of human in there. And I ran into this kid. He was 11 or 12. His name was Soslan, and I just asked him, do you know what happened here? And I didn't ask a second question, and perhaps I shouldn't have even asked the first. And he just spent the next hour walking me through, and then we were here, and we had no water to drink, so. We sucked on we'd peed our underwear, we sucked on that, and then over here my friend got shot, and I had to step over the bot, and it was just this kid like not processing, because he had no emotion to his voice, everything he'd gone through, and whenever I think, sort of the days where I wondered why do we, it's important to have been there to borne witness, but it was, one of those days where there's not enough pay in the world for that kind of job, right, to have to go through that and try and process that.
And then weeks later, you find yourself in the Orange Revolution. Yeah,
it was right on the heels of each other, these stories. And looking back, it was an amazing decision by the Globe to sort of decide that it was time to move on to the Middle East, because from where I was standing, Russia was, and its neighbors, Ukraine, Georgia, were all changing very rapidly. And they had a correspondent in the middle of the story who, at that point, was finally sort of comfortable speaking in Russian and really sort of had my own network of contacts. And then we decided to pull out and move on. So, it was a very wild year, 2004, 2005.
I mean, how was the shift? Did you regret the Globe's decision to move you on?
Oh, I fought against it bitterly, to be honest. It's all being recorded. But yeah, it was. I argued, and this is an argument that I think you can take both sides of that. I'm finally, you finally have a correspondent who's not just picking up the newspapers and reporting what he's read in them. I'm contributing, and they were like, great, now get to the Middle East. And from their perspective, at that time, the theory was that you could be in a bureau or a posting too long, and you would lose your sense of what Canadian readers wanted to understand about a place, and you get too deep into a story. And perhaps I'd sort of verged towards the edge of that cliff, and it was time to move on. But in my mind, I thought, like, this is not the time to move on and take on a new challenge. This is the time to become an expert. But there's this debate: do you want your newspaper journalist to be an expert in something, or someone who sort of shares your or shares the average reader's sort of take on things, and is able to sort of capture, thereby write more engagingly, I suppose.
And from the Middle East, you moved to Beijing. So in some ways, you were then in a position where you could really compare the two major authoritarian regimes on the planet.
Yes.
How do they compare?
I had a fascinating experience, and I think it was the end of 2011, and there were elections in Russia again, and this was the election season that turned into all the protests against Putin in Moscow. But we weren't terribly committed. We didn't have a Moscow bureau anymore. We'd closed it down in 2009. And so they sent me to Vladikavkaz, which is the farthest east point in Russia, or actually not technically not, but farthest east major city. And just to show that we were still paying attention to the story. The idea was, write about election day in Russia, then fly home. And then suddenly these protests broke out in Moscow, and I was flying across the country to have a look at this uprising. Well, we didn't know what it was. And I went to Pushkin Square, where they had this great big rally, and there was this crowd of people, and they were standing in the middle of Moscow shouting, "Россия без Putina, Russia without Putin," and tweeting about it and taking pictures and posting it, and the police were sort of hanging back and waiting for it to die down before they eventually sort of, once the permit for the protest had expired, they moved in and arrested people and gave them 15-day detentions. And that night I went out for a sort of a nightcap with the current Moscow press corps, and they were all saying, "Oh, this country, turning into a dictatorship." And I was thinking, I just witnessed a protest against the regime in the middle of the city, and we tweeted about it. In Beijing, that doesn't happen. That's a very, I've been on Tiananmen Square on June the 4th, the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown, and if someone lights a candle, they get tackled. And Twitter is blocked in the first place. So there are, the word dictatorship, I think, gets tossed around quite a bit, and there are different levels of authoritarian states, and Russia's definitely become more authoritarian over the 15 years that I've been covering it, but it's not yet China, it's certainly not North Korea, it's certainly not Syria. And I think we have to, maybe some nuance sometimes is worth adding to these discussions.
Mm-hmm. So you reported obviously on the annexation of Crimea, Donbass, and yet I've heard you say that while that shocked the rest of the world, it didn't shock you. Why?
I think, and this ties into the conversation about China a little bit. I was in Crimea when the what became known as the polite people, these masked Russian soldiers, took over the peninsula, and there was this staged referendum. And I flew back to Kiev because John Baird, the foreign minister at the time, was coming in to give a press conference, or to meet with Ukrainian officials and give a press conference. And then afterwards, somebody knew that I'd just been in Crimea, so from the Canadian embassy, brought me down to some reception in the hotel and said, can you talk to, there was these defense ministers from Italy and from 3 or 4 other NATO countries, and they were just going like, well, what did you see? And I basically told them what was already in the newspaper. There were Russian troops that had taken over the train station and the airport and the land border, and they were like, well, when are they going back? And I thought, wow, you guys in all you do is strategic planning, and you never gamed it out that if there was an uprising in Kiev in the West supported it, that Russia might react in this way, which to me was very obvious or to be expected. And that goes, what I mean by the connection to China is every Western government understands very well that if you open up an embassy in Taiwan, the retaliation from the Chinese government is unpredictable. It's just, you've crossed a red line. And I think over the years, as we've paid less attention to Russia, I mean, the Globe and Mail closed its office there in 2009. Other media organizations shrank. The Canadian government used to have a consulate in St. Petersburg. They don't have one anymore. Our understanding of what Russia cares about and how it might act shrank as well. And so we were on a back foot, we, the West, through that whole sequence of events through Donbass, through Crimea, because there was no one who thought, well, if we do, if A, then they might do B, because we just had lost grasp of what it looked like from Moscow.
You've been witness to two revolutions in Ukraine, 2004, 2014. How do those link to the events in Donbass and Crimea, and what's next?
The big difference when I got to the second revolution in 2014, I naturally called up the people that I knew from the first revolution, and I spoke to this woman named Nina, who had been one of the heads of sort of the youth movement in 2014, who had sort of helped organize the street protests. And I asked her, I said, so what's different this time? And she said something that stuck with me. She said, this time we don't care if Crimea and Donbass come with us. And it showed an understanding that I think sometimes gets confused in media reporting. It's that there was a cultural difference between what the bulk of Ukraine wanted and what these very Russified regions, and the histories of Crimea, it was part of Russia until it was given during the Soviet era to Ukraine, and Donbass, which is heavily Russified by Soviet policy. They moved in Russian workers to sort of work in the mines there. But they created a different culture, a different mindset in those places. And I think that after the first revolution, a lot of Ukrainians in the west of the country, in the center of the country, came to blame Donbass and Crimea because they were the ones who kept voting for Yanukovych to come back into power. They kept voting for this sort of pro-Russian government that undid the first revolution. So that, to me, was. And now when you talk to Ukrainian policymakers, and I've interviewed the Prime Minister, not this year but last year, and when the microphone's off, the real discussion is, like, how do we acknowledge that it's time, that maybe we're going in different directions, it may be impossible to put it all back together. You can't say it out loud because you'd be branded a traitor immediately, but there's an understanding that there's a break in what different parts of Ukraine want for the future, and maybe it doesn't easily stay together.
So you've been based in Russia, you've lived in Russia, you speak Russian. When you report in Ukraine, does that influence the way people see you? I mean, they see you as a Canadian journalist, but does the fact that you've lived and worked in Russia, does that have a bearing?
It's a very good question, and I think it certainly, it's one of the biggest complaints of Ukrainian Canadian readers, for sure. I remember the first time I reported from Kiev in 2002. I got two blocks of emails. One was about how we spelled the city Kiev, K-I-E-V, which is actually a transliteration of the Russian name for the city rather than Kyiv, K-Y-I-V. And then the second one was, why don't you have an office in Ukraine to balance these things out? And it definitely does. You do tend to. When you're in a city, you do absorb, the local culture, and you absorb the local media. And when I was based in Jerusalem, did that color, how I saw what was happening in the Arab states around it? Perhaps it did. But there's simply, in a perfect world, we would have bureaus in both places, and I would be an advocate of that if we had endless budgets. There wasn't really a way around it.
In terms of historical significance, how would you rank Russia's annexation of Crimea?
I think it's, when you think of sort of the major turning points that we've witnessed in recent years, I mean, there's obviously, everyone thinks September the 11th was huge. We all woke up in a different world after that. The invasion of Iraq was another one that I tend to think is, everything since then has the world spun a little bit differently since that. And I think the invasion of, the seizure and annexation of Crimea is another one, because it ends what was, since the end of the Cold War anyways, a quarter century of American-dominated world order was very clearly at an end, because Russia obviously had a different perspective. They hated the war in Kosovo and the declaration of independence of Kosovo. They hated the invasion of Iraq. They hated what happened in Libya, but they were effectively powerless to do anything about it. And this was Russia seizing the initiative, setting new, giving notice that it wasn't going to play by the old rules anymore. And in addition to that, I mean, and since then you've seen how that has, we've seen how they acted in Syria after that, how they've acted in North Korea since that. I mean, they now are truly trying to approach the United States as equals, which I don't think they dared to do in the 20 years before that.
I mean, before Crimea, your book came out, and your book was called The New Cold War.
Yes.
I mean, was there something inevitable about this positioning of Russia as somehow an enemy of the West?
There might have been something inevitable about the title. I didn't want the title. My publisher and my agent said, this is what you have to call it. And to be honest, I sort of had to rewrite the first and last chapter to sort of fit the title that I could put on the book they thought this would sell better. But yeah, and I think that perhaps gets to the core of it. There was my take, and this comes towards the end of the book, was no, it wasn't inevitable, because the Russia that I arrived in 2001, 2002, there really were people inside the Kremlin who were pro-Western reformers that me as a Western journalist I could approach and speak to, and you get a sense of what the debate was happening behind the red walls. And those people, and I could name them, were convinced that Russia could and should be friends with the West. And there was a second sort of group within the Kremlin, which was called the Siloviki. They're the men of power, the KGB folks, and of course Putin hailed from the same background. But I think during those early years in power, he was listening to both sides and then making a decision. And over time, and if you look at just the things I mentioned, Kosovo, the fall, the toppling of Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, the expansion of NATO into the Baltic states, from a Russian perspective, and again, I'm not saying this is correct, I'm saying they began to feel under siege, and Putin began to think, these guys who say that we can never get along with the West, the ex-KGB guys, they're right, and these liberal reformers are naive. And so the Kremlin today doesn't have, there are very few sort of people that you can, as a Western journalist, try and meet. The walls are closed. They see us as, and since Crimea, I think we've even entered, the mindset in Russia has become one of, we're effectively in a clash, a civilizational one, you can call it a hybrid war, some people call it, this is now a conflict with the West. And that, I think, could have been averted by some more careful stepping along the way.